right, welcome everyone to another episode of the Cosmic Matrix podcast. Today with your host Bernhard Guenther and my very special guest from India, Kolkata, Neelesh Marik. And Neelesh and I, we have been friends for a few years, and we've been talking a lot via Skype and on Facebook about various spiritual philosophies and the times we're in right now. In particular about Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga and his work with the Mother together. And that's a very deep philosophy in itself and a spiritual practice. And it's more of a revelation than even a teaching, as the Mother used to say. And listeners of my podcast know, her followers of work, that I've referenced Sri Aurobindo's work in my writings for many years. And I personally got into his work 5 years ago, first with Satpram's book, Sri Aurobindo, or The Adventure of Consciousness, and now kind of working myself through the Life Divine and a synthesis of yoga and the letters on yoga. And I realized more and more the importance of the core message and teaching of Sri Aurobindo, which, you know, at first I was even like, I have to just share real quick myself, I dismissed Sri Aurobindo because just by his name I was another guru and like what I'm done and over with that. But once I started to realize what this man has actually taught, what he has also brought to the world, he is truly the last avatar that has lived on this earth, so to speak. So we want to get all into that in this podcast. First of all, welcome, Neelesh. Great to have you on.
Namaste. Thank you.
Thank you. To set the stage, I like to share a quote by the Mother, which kind of ties into the times we're in right now as well. And I believe from the Mother's agenda. I'm not exactly what year it was. Maybe you remember that. But it really relates to exactly what we are facing in this day and age. And she writes, or she said, at this moment in time, we are at a decisive turning point in the history of the earth. Once again, from every side, I'm asked, what is going to happen? Everywhere there's anguish, expectation, fear. What is going to happen? There's only one reply. If only man could consent to be spiritualized. And perhaps it would be enough if some individuals become pure gold, for this will be enough to change the course of events. We are faced with this necessity in a very urgent way. This courage, this heroism, which the divine wants of us, why not use it to fight against one's own difficulties, one's own imperfections, one's own obscurities? Why not heroically face the furnace of inner purification so that it does not become necessary to pass once more through one of those terrible, gigantic destructions which plunge an entire civilization into darkness? This is the problem before us. It is for each one to solve it in his own way. How do we solve it, Neelesh? Let's maybe just start with, giving for the listeners who are not really aware of Sri Aurobindo's work and the Mother's work, maybe some sort of overview of his philosophy and teaching, if that's possible, or wherever you want to start.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So basically, as you said rightly, what is important to understand but not easy to get our head around is the concept of the avatar. And because there have been a lot of fake and false avatars and gurus in the world, this whole subject is very controversial. So the notion about gurus and cults and everything is essentially can be seen as a play of cosmic forces. And as your work also covers this, whenever there is a force that wants to do good, there is almost equally strong force that opposes it. And that is the nature of the play of forces by which the distillation of civilization and of consciousness happens. It's not a walk in the park, basically. So what we have seen in the last, over the human civilization, but specifically in the last few hundred years, is that the battle between the benevolent and the malevolent forces has become fiercer and fiercer. And this also ties in with the notion of the cosmic cycle of the 4 yugas, which in the East and the Indian spiritual tradition is clearly delineated. The Satya Yuga is the age of truth, and the Kali Yuga is the culmination point where the destructive cycle has to fully play itself out before the birth of the next Satya Yuga or the next age of truth. So what the churn that we are currently experiencing is the throes of Kali Yuga, and we are probably in its most intense and darkest phase. And therefore, it is not unsurprising that at this time there needed to be an emanation or an incarnation of the Supreme Force, in whatever way we want to understand the Supreme Force, theistically, atheistically. But there is a Supreme Force, there is an intelligence that is governing governing all of creation. And from the unmanifest or the formless domain in which that force operates, there needs to be a manifestation in the terrestrial existence, which is what we find ourselves in, and which actually coincidentally has been designed for the perfect evolution. And Sri Aurobindo represents such an avataric descent. There have been other avataric descents before, but as we said, that the Kali Yuga, the time that we are in, is particularly challenging and perhaps the most challenging in the history of humanity. And therefore, the avataric descent needed to be of a power and a scope of a magnitude that could help humanity tie through this. And that is what Sri Aurobindo and the Mother represents. Mm-hmm. So that is the kind of the esoteric significance of what they represent and what they are. They are in human form, but they represent a power of a completely different order of magnitude. And the difference between them and many other teachers is that they manage to take it to its ultimate consummation. In other words, the mission, the descent of the avataric emanation in human form is one part of it, and then the human form, the human incarnation, working through the entire range of cosmic forces to establish with complete certainty the possibility and the actualization of heaven on earth, or the divine provenance on earth, is what needed to have been done through a certain ascension process. And that was completed to the complete summit by Sri Aurobindo and the Mother.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting because when you look at Sri Aurobindo's life, it's very fascinating just on the nutshell, because he actually grew up, he was sent as a young boy to England to get his education there, went through this whole English education, right? And then didn't go back to India until his early 20s, I believe, and got very politically engaged. He was a political activist, maybe even anarchist and nationalist, and just trying to help to liberate India from the English occupation. And he was even rising, engaging in even violent activism, you may say, or just kind of more, very forceful activism. But eventually he even got then imprisoned. He spent time in prison, solitary confinement, and that's where he found his yoga, basically, right? So that's kind of his first experience. So it's really fascinating. He came from this very political revolutionary towards Sri Aurobindo, the yogic master, and then finding his own yoga. And it's also fascinating because, like you mentioned, there's something else he established on Earth, which most people are not aware of, because in the last 20 or so years, he spent in solitude to do the yoga, right? Really basically what you were hinting at, I believe, is bringing down what he calls the supramental consciousness, this opportunity, which we are also able maybe to tag in through, and his accelerator, the Mother and whatnot. So that's really what a lot of people, I feel, don't understand with his yoga, that, like you said, he had, there's a whole, it's not just a teaching, it's not just a practice, there's something he represented and manifested during his time. So is that correct?
Yes, I mean, so there are, his work can be looked at in two phases. The first is his own ascension journey, which began after he came back from England. Incidentally, in his childhood, his father had designed that he is completely cut off from the Indian spiritual heritage and the richness. So he basically first went and understood the rest of the world, the Western world, and studied the classics and Western philosophy and everything else. And then after he came back to India, having got a ringside view of the rest of the world, the Greek and the Latin, and including the European classics, his ascension journey began when he landed in India from Baroda. He went through his own process. He went through the nirvana process. It took him 3 days. What is normally understood as the Buddhist nirvana, the stature of emptiness and complete freedom from all movements of nature. And then he realized that that is just the beginning, and he was not interested in personal liberation.
Yeah,
which is what the earlier parts or some parts of the Buddhist credo is all about. Although there are other parts of Buddhism where there is Mahayana, especially where there is a larger vision beyond the personal salvation. But he then his primary objective was to channelize this power into the liberation movement for India from British rule. And as you rightly said, he got extremely involved in that, and he was a very fiery, very fiery writer and orator. And therefore, his words and his speech and his writing and his thought process had a kind of kindling effect on the Indian freedom movement. And he was clearly not a moderate. He could be called an extremist in that sense, because he believed moderation was going to get us nowhere. So he was not a middle path believer, if you can look at it that way. And then the decisive turning happened when he went to jail, and it was an act by the grace for him to be told what he was here for. And it's a very interesting journey, but we're not getting to hear where he heard the voice on why he was here and why it was necessary at this point for him to turn. So from that prison life till 1926, he was on his own ascension journey. And he completed the journey in November 24, 1926, which is called Siddhi Day. From then till 1950, which was the year where he transitioned from his physical incarnation, the work was only for the earth. So the personal work was over. And if the personal ascension or reaching the personal summit was the goal, that was already done and dusted. Thereafter, the work was only for the earth, for bringing the power down into the terrestrial domain, so that humanity could be saved. But it could not be completed in the sense of full execution because of the resistance of humanity.
Right.
And the propensity of humanity.
And the mud rising up, the opposition of the other forces, right?
Yeah, I mean, and the opposition of forces can be understood in a way as stemming from the ignorance and the refusal of humanity to rise. So that's when the forces have the opportunity. The forces exist. The forces exist in the cosmosphere. All world propensities and tendencies and inclinations exist, right? So whenever, if you can think of the four forces of the divine, of truth and light and joy and life, by the very nature of creation, four anti-divine forces you can think of as matter, antimatter, in a very crude sense, to use an analogy of modern physics. So they get created as propensities immediately, but the propensities cannot act unless the manifestation or the instruments of manifestation provide them the opening. And the opening is provided by, the three gunas, by ignorance, by tamas, rajas, and even sattva, for that matter, the sattvic ego. And that is the opportunity for the anti-divine forces to have their full play and enjoy themselves at our expense. And we are providing that opportunity almost perfectly.
Yeah. So that's what even Sri Aurobindo or the mother said, that this yoga is a battle. So on that note, what is really, to get into his yoga, the integral yoga, because his yoga is very distinctive from any other yoga or even spiritual practice, which you just hinted at, because most in the old days, spiritual realization or actualization was basically about escaping the world into some state of nirvana, like personal liberation, right? And, we see the extreme in India with the aesthetics, to ignore matter, neglect life, the physical world is bad, like even self-mutilation, the body. But for Sri Aurobindo and the mother was about bringing down the supramental consciousness, right? So what is so different about Sri Aurobindo's yoga to compare to all the other yogas out there?
So let's start from the philosophical foundation. So, the whole philosophical movement across the world has various streams. Mm-hmm. Greece, even before Greece, there are Persian origins of philosophy. Basically, philosophy being understood as the science, as the science of knowledge on what basically, which addresses the deeper existential questions, right? So, in my own experience, having studied, various types of philosophy and schools of philosophy, it was only when I came across Sri Aurobindo I understood that that something could be so complete and so comprehensive and so well integrated, and integrated to the point that even a mental consciousness, which is where we reside, can fully understand it, provided there is a certain dedication and faith to the process. So he has constructed a complete philosophical system to first enable the mental consciousness to understand things. And that nobody else has done. With the level of comprehensiveness, precision, logical consistency, and truth resonance, than anybody else. So that's the first thing, but that's just the starting point. From that understanding, where there is no gap and there is no question unanswered or no issue of human life, both in the individual and in the collective sense, there is nothing unanswered or unaddressed. Let's put it that way. Once that foundation becomes clear in our mind or in our mental level of consciousness, one can then begin on a solid foundation to invoke the active side of consciousness. The passive side of consciousness can be understood as awareness or knowledge in the informational sense. The active side of consciousness is power, right? So, Chit, the Chit of Satchitananda, which means consciousness, is actually the short form of Chit Shakti, which means power, right? So the active side of consciousness is power, which means when we say knowledge is power, which we use in a different context, that we have information, therefore we can do things. But in a yogic sense, knowledge is power is a much deeper concept. It means that when my consciousness is in contact with the Supreme, I have a different vantage point of consciousness as power, which helps me to navigate the world and deal with the forces of nature. Mm-hmm. So this cannot happen unless the philosophical foundation is watertight and completely secure, right? Because if there are unanswered questions and unresolved dilemmas in our mental vital complex, then there are gaps, right? The problem with all other spiritual teachings is that despite rapid progress that they have made and despite the phenomenological validity of what they say, because they haven't gone right till the end, till the summit, there are incomplete portions. There are logical inconsistencies. There are even contradictions. And whenever there are gaps, there is the possibility of who to get in.
Right.
Yeah. So
we call it, just for the listeners, the anti-divine, the occult forces, hostile forces. Yeah.
Exactly. So in Kali Yuga, when, as we said, the fierceness of the battle is so intense, gaps are not permissible. Because gaps, even the slightest gap, and that's the reason why we see that, spiritual cults and the abuse and all of that stuff that has happened throughout the world, despite very good intentions and despite very noble visions that many of these cults have begun with, because there have these gaps have been left because of the nature of the density of consciousness and to take the easy way out and the attack of the ego and various other factors. These gaps have remained, and therefore the forces have entered and they have destroyed even the good foundations that have been built. So the first thing to understand is that a self-sufficient, complete, comprehensive system sourced from the highest wisdom, which is therefore complete, and therefore it is complete truth. There is no room for falsehood. That is the first necessity. So this is from a philosophical standpoint. But Sri Aurobindo's contribution is way, way more than that. On that philosophical foundation, which is what most of his writings in the Arya have been in the before 1920, in the 10 years between 1910 and 1920, that's the work he had done for the rest of the humanity to read and understand. And it's all available to us, free and written in English language, right? So
that's also
never had it so good.
Actually, on that note too, because of his upbringing we just shared before, like all of his writings are his original writings in English, right? So the transmission it's not translated from
there is no loss in translation. Exactly.
Yeah.
So people who understand English, which is probably, a lot of people, most of the people, his English is difficult, but it is, as I said, with what he requires is an open mind and a submission and a certain faith. Which is what sometimes a westernized scientific materialist paradigm makes it a bit difficult, because the skepticism comes in before faith.
Yeah.
And in this yoga, it is important to note that faith produces experience, whereas the notion of the materialist scientific science is that experience produces faith, or experience produces belief, or whatever, right?
Right.
That unless I have the experience, I will not believe. But here is the other way around. Here, that's why we talk of surrender and all that stuff. We'll get into that later.
Right.
So this faith is necessary, and it is very difficult for. And I have faced this myself, having grown up in my background is science and technology, and for most of my life I've been westernized in my outlook, and I can see that has its role to play, and there's a certain discipline of mental rigor and discipline and bullshit detection that is absolutely necessary. But that's not sufficient, because that can create a barrier to the light getting in when one has to move from the mental to the intuitive level of consciousness.
Right.
And that's a very, very big barrier for the westernized, materialized, material scientific mind. And I've seen it in some very, very, very advanced thinkers who are friends of mine and yours, who face this challenge, who are stuck there because they are not able to let that mental, intellectual, skeptical guard down. And until they can do that, the light is not going to enter.
Yeah.
So what they consider a spiritual experience is actually a higher mental experience.
Yeah.
Not a spiritual
on that, I can also relate this in my own way, my own intellect in its own way, or the mind just the extreme skepticism, the questioning, right? And the reluctance of the surrender and accessing almost a higher intellect, so to speak, right? But it also reminds me of, in a sense, talking about some other maybe inferior teachings, but that served myself in my life. Guenther, for example, he was not a realized being, but there's a lot of, great tools and truth in his teaching that helped me along my path. But he also, in his, from coming from esoteric Christianity, Sufism, and the mystery schools, talked about, the three types of man, physical man, man one, emotional man, man two, and the intellect, mental man, man three. And he said man three maybe knows a lot intellectually, but has the hardest time in the work because the intellect is in the way. And I remember Sri Aurobindo also writing about it. I remember just in Sarprem's book when he shared about when Sri Aurobindo came face to face with his own mental barrier, the mental fortress, realizing it's just going in circles and the intellect just becomes addicted to intellectual knowledge, but it's not letting in the experience, right? That's also ties into what, I think you're alluding to, that we are right now, even Sri Aurobindo talked about, in the age of mental man, right? So it has its phase, so to speak, or part of an age.
Not only is it is actually indispensable. Full intellectual development is indispensable. As we talked about cosmic forces, you actually have to go through something which actually becomes your enemy later. Now, the New Age spiritual movement have dropped the mind, and many of our Advaita traditions from India are responsible for that. Drop the mind, let the mind go. That is a complete error because if you drop the mind, you remain submental and you remain vital. And basically, you remain at a level which is instinctive. But instinct is not the same as intuition. Intuition is instinct plus a fully developed intellect. Otherwise, the intuition cannot develop. It does not have the bulwark or the foundation to form a complete or a direct pathway to the truth. So if you can look at the history of religion, ancient religion was largely instinctive. It was submental or vitalistic religion. That didn't get anywhere. That got us into deep trouble in many ways. Yeah. And then, so nature follows this cycle because nature is ultimately behind nature is the occult intelligence of spirit. So nature, despite her crude and very violent ways, follows this slow unfolding and journey of evolutionary progression from one stage of consciousness to another. So the mental level of consciousness is absolutely indispensable. Anybody who thinks that we can drop the mind is committing a grievous error. But at the same time, after the mind is fully developed, it has to give way. Yeah. And there is no way out. It is very difficult and it can be a block, but there is no way around it. It has to develop fully so that I have my full bullshit detection mechanism in place. But on that, the faith has to open to a higher domain, leveraging the full power of the intellect to guide us into intuitive consciousness. And that is why as you would know, he talks about the higher mind, the illumined mind, the intuitive mind, and then the overmind. Each stage is absolutely important, and none of them can be bypassed, none of them can be jettisoned. There is a clear scientific process of spiritual evolution, but this scientific is not the science we understand. Right. It is a larger and a bigger science.
Now, thank you for pointing that out, because it's true. Like in the New Age pop spirituality, say just, get off your mind, just think with your heart, and just trust your feeling. Just the vital almost drive, just unexamined, and just we know the issue of lack of critical thinking in this day and age, even the basics. So we need to definitely absolutely develop the mind, but not get stuck in it. Reminds me also, maybe not to get but same idea from oversimplification of Eastern spiritual teaching of just destroy your ego, let go of your ego. And then people like, especially in the Western world, we have dealing with trauma, wounds and whatnot, and fall into more self-diminishment and cannot stand up for themselves because the ego is bad, everything is selfish. And even I remember Sri Aurobindo talked about that. No, before being able to engage in the great work, so to speak, we need to have developed that, which we then get rid of later. That paradox, right? That individual self. Yeah.
Well, it's a very important point to mention, because probably when we have the opportunity to get deeper into his philosophy, but it's worth mentioning in passing here that the three aspects of the terrestrial manifestation, especially the evolutionary journey that we have to go through, requires the simultaneous understanding of three aspects: the individual, the universal, and the transcendent. And each has its significance, but without getting into the detail, basically the individual is absolutely necessary without a full individual organization of the being, the spiritual evolution is not possible. And the first step to the individualization of the being is actually a healthy and mature ego. Because the ego represents the center of identity and the fulcrum of action. To get rid of it is an equal folly as getting rid of the mind. I mean, that's disaster.
Yeah.
And if you prematurely get rid of the ego, you're actually opening yourself to the hostile forces. Because if there is nothing there, then guess who will occupy it? So, but again, what has to be understood is that the healthy development of the ego is a necessary but not a sufficient condition. It's the same thing as we talked about in the mind. The only thing that happens is that the ego as the center of identity moves from the outer surface self, organized around the mind, life, energy, body complex, to what is called the psychic entity, which is the soul. And that journey is an inward journey, which Sri Aurobindo's yoga clearly outlines, describes, and enables. And that has to be, and without that journey inwards, which means transformation of the outer egoic self as the center of identity or the fulcrum of action to the psychic being or the soul, until that happens, the spiritual descent cannot take place.
Mm-hmm.
By spiritual descent, I mean the descent of the force.
Right.
To spiritualize the being, as you mentioned, the spiritualization. So here again, it is very important to understand what spirituality means. There are too many definitions and too many meanings. Some people even think spirituality means to feel good or feel kind or feel moral or ethical. That's not the case at all. Right? So the whole notion of what spirituality means is itself a huge welter of confusion that adds to the problem.
Yeah. To all the confusions throughout the ages anyway, and the distortions. So we touched upon, like, because also to really understand one of the bases of Sri Aurobindo's work and vision is also that he always stated that man is a transitional being, right? So that's the core philosophy, that we haven't finished evolution on all levels. We're not final. We're in a transitionary state. And we seem to, quote unquote, forget that, because we assume that, we are God's perfect creation, or this is we are the evolutionary peak of everything else, but we actually haven't finished our whole evolution. When, in fact, when you would compare it to animals and whatnot and species, they have in themselves completed their evolution. They are more holistic in a sense than we are, right? But we are in a transitional state. So what does Sri Aurobindo mean that man is that we are not final, that we are in a transitional state and a transitional being?
So if you compare this with the Western philosophical or the scientific materialist paradigm, the objective function of life is to optimize our own well-being, right? And when we say optimize our whole well-being, is to be happy, live well, be prosperous, and if you can, please care for others and have an ordered society and a mature political, social system, a decent education, etc., etc. This is what we understand is a good life, right? Now, this is a mental conception of life where the underlying assumption is the perfect man is our end state. Sri Aurobindo turns that on his head. He says the perfect man is just an intermediary state of a much longer transformation journey. On one side of the transformation journey is the animal nature, and the other side of the transformation journey is the divine nature. Now, we don't exactly understand. We have an idea of what animal nature means because we observe animals, and we can also feel our own animal instincts and our primal and our atavistic movements in ourselves, at least if you're slightly self-aware and conscious. But we don't know what divine nature means because it's just a word, and we have no idea. That's, as I said, we think it's to be a good person, a kind person, a moral person, an ethical person, a compassionate person. These are not entirely false, but they're very poor and weak approximations of what divine nature means. So divine nature basically means the full power and the consciousness and the operating method of the Supreme. Nothing less than that. So as you can see, it's a pretty modest goal. So when we begin to understand that, it's Sri Aurobindo in the second last chapter of the Life Divine, he actually defines what is a Gnostic being, right? We can have a sneak preview of that chapter. And the Gnostic being is essentially humanity who has basically completed the journey from animal nature to divine nature. And why does one need to do that? So that we have the divine life. And that's the last chapter of the Life Divine, which basically means that after an individual has completed his journey to being a divine being of divine nature, which means a full transformation of the animal nature through the current human nature, which is an intermediary state, into a divine nature, we basically have heaven on earth. And that's the promise of the Life Divine, that heaven does not need to be anywhere else, in some other realm, in some other domain, in some vaguely understood territory, or in some parallel universe or some stuff. Its possibility is inherent and is destined and is now assured right here, right where we are. Mm-hmm. And that's our job. And that's the job that Sri Aurobindo has made possible for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's also the core, what we call philosophy, or the in terms of the Life Divine, that it's about spiritualizing, like the Mother said, ourselves, to bring down the supramental, the divine, to transform the body, the earth, matter, to spiritualize it instead of reaching to somewhere else.
That is true. Basically, one thing he does is he reconciles and unifies the spirit-matter dichotomy, which has, right from the Greek philosophical days, this whole dualistic metaphysics of spirit being one thing and matter being another, or the noumenal being something and the phenomenal being something. I mean, Plato and, in the recent times, Immanuel Kant being the most influential, if you can call it that, philosopher, basically created this dualistic metaphysics where there was no bridge between the two, and therefore it left us in a quandary. Mm-hmm. Sri Aurobindo not only resolves and unifies this framework through a certain ontology, a certain redefined metaphysics, which is the first philosophical foundation. He then builds on that. So if we can quickly go through his, we talked about those 6 things in philosophy. So there is a fully unified, consistent metaphysics, and a cosmology of the structure of the universe, and an occult hierarchy of planes, of 7 planes. This has to be understood first. Otherwise, we cannot even start. Mm-hmm. From there, we have to understand the nature of the self. Who are we? What is the constitution of who are we? Skin, mind, body, what? We have no clue, right? Normally, we have or even from Western philosophy, this whole ego notion and all that good stuff. But this has to be understood in the backdrop of the cosmology and the structure of the universe.
The cosmology, number one, meaning what is reality?
What is reality? Yes.
Exactly.
What is reality? So cosmology basically means the structure of the universe, and metaphysics is what is reality. Basically, they are related.
Yeah.
And cosmogony is the creation of the universe. In Savitri, he goes into cosmogony as well. But so what is, right? What is the answer? That is metaphysics or ontology. From there, who are we? Who am I? Right? That is the philosophy of self-identity. So that's the next step. The third thing is, how do we know? Which in Western philosophy is called epistemology. So Sri Aurobindo's epistemology is the most comprehensive and the most, it basically spans the entire domain across four domains of knowledge, right? All of this is in his work in the Life Divine and various other places. So what is reality? Who are we? And how do we know? And how do we employ those means of knowledge? And knowledge here is not just informational knowledge as we normally understand it. This knowledge is knowledge of consciousness contact with the Supreme. Right? So that is what is called self-knowledge with a capital S. And then we get to ethics. What is the right thing to do? What are we here for? Which is what this transitional being thing, and what is our job? What is our role? Do we even understand why we are here, or are we just flitting around like a piece of paper tossed around in the wind? That's the question. And so that is ethics. And then comes politics. How do we work together? We are not an island. We are not alone. We are together with each other, right? How do we work together for harmony and peace? We haven't figured that out after several centuries or millennia, right? We still haven't figured it out. So that is the fifth thing. And then finally, there is the refinement, the journey to the good, the true, and the beautiful, primarily premised around beauty, which is what is conventionally known as aesthetics. So this is the full, the constitution of the philosophy, on which one has to then premise the spiritual ascension journey.
Thanks. So the last point, beauty, also is, I think, important to mention that it's not what we understand under beauty from like the vital matrix perspective, right? So this is more just like beauty of like, can we just describe that real quick from the...
So one is human beauty, the vital, the whole sexual side. That is a big subject in itself.
Yeah.
It's a very, very important subject. If you don't have time today, maybe after some time. But if you just look at beauty in terms of something which is pleasing, something which is aesthetically uplifting, and which helps us refine and subtleize our sensibilities and our sensitivity. So that's the whole domain of art, and there's a philosophy of art itself.
Yeah.
Art for art's sake, art as a representation of reality as it is, or art as a representation of reality as it can be and should be. And there's there's a whole philosophy of aesthetics itself. But primarily, what we understand, aesthetics is a tool for gratification, some kind of gratification. Now, it can be a gross gratification or a finer gratification, and there is a stratum there, there's a spectrum there, but it is gratification of the self as understood by the skin-encapsulated ego. Sri Aurobindo redefines this as a movement towards divine self-expression. So basically, it is a process or a mechanism or a technology, if you will, related to soul identity or self-identity. Once we understand who we are, how do we bring about that refinement from gross animal nature towards divine nature? How does the pursuit of the beautiful and the true and the good enable us not to gratify ourselves, but make a spontaneous expression of who we are with an ascension journey towards divine qualities? That is the real meaning of aesthetics.
Okay. No, thank you. So these 6 aspects you mentioned, from what is reality, the cosmology, who am I, how do I know, ethics, and so on. I mean, these all happen.
Metaphysics. So let's summarize it.
Summarize.
So let's keep cosmology out for the moment. Metaphysics, self-identity, epistemology, ethics, politics, aesthetics.
Beautiful. So all of that also work together at the same time, interrelated, obviously.
Of course.
Yeah,
of
just
course.
to make this sure that, And also the way we approach it is like, that's a process in itself, because to really go deeper, it also depends on our own, what I would call level of being or self-development, to be able to grasp it, these different
So to understand the philosophy, as we mentioned, the mind has to become a suitable vehicle, with full individualized organization, free from the tyranny of the masses and the collectivist pollution and all of that stuff. That's very, very important, which is the point you mentioned, that the ego has to have a healthy individuation so that it's not caught up by the lowest common denominator of the mass. That's very important. And related to that, when we talked about mental development, reading Aurobindo's philosophy enables that process by itself.
Yeah.
It puts the mind through difficulty, but a necessary difficulty to begin to try to understand him. And just by trying to read him, the structure of the mind changes.
Yeah.
The neuronal structure, the whole architecture of the mind, by trying to read him and trying to go through the difficulty, however challenging it might be. I've experienced myself. to try to plow through him, even if it is one paragraph a day, and it can be very difficult. But even if it is one paragraph or one page a day, that difficulty, and then when you sleep on it, it works in your subconscious and lots of things happen. But because his words are infused with the consciousness of this from the highest source, there is a certain alchemical process that we are not aware of that begins to happen on us. Yeah. From our mental consciousness, we are just reading some words, this philosophy is difficult, I'm not getting it. That's a suboptimal interpretation. If we keep at it, whether we read his poetry or his prose, there is an alchemical process that begins, and that basically raises our mental capacity to the necessary level required before it can begin to ascend to the spiritual domain. Yeah. This is very, very important to understand.
Very important.
Whoever wants to explore this path.
Yeah, because I thank you for sharing that. I can relate this myself. As I mentioned at the beginning, I've been reading for the past 5 years ago. And interesting, first I rejected it. It was like, because I had my own triggers around the name, but different people brought it to me. So something really wanted to get me, and then started reading it like, oh, shit, basically. This is, there's something about it. And I remember maybe we can touch it upon some other time. I first read also Satprem's book, Sri Aurobindo, The Adventure of Consciousness, which is, a good introduction, but it's written by Satprem. But there's something in the mother coming through. It's a beautiful summary, right? So it has its own way. But once I also started reading his, I'm chewing through The Life Divine right now, read his original work, and I have these little pocket books. There's some great pocket quotes here and there, about different topics. Once you read, it's true, like, there's something happens within your consciousness or brain. And I'm some of the work, like The Life Divine, like you said, literally just read a chapter or a page a day, because it's really a mental exercise on some level, because some of the sentences are literally like this. So you would call them run-on sentences, right? So there's a certain flow to it, right? Then once you get into it, like, whoa, okay, there's a different level, a different state of consciousness you almost enter once you're in that flow. Do you know what I mean?
There's a very important point about, you mentioned large sentences, and there's the large sentences are difficult to navigate, but it is important to do it because it captures the totality of the idea. Mm-hmm. The specific idea that is being presented, it is important that it is covered in one sentence, because once you understand it is one sentence and wrestle with the mind to have the integrative capacity to hold the different bits of information in this sentence, but then integrate them into a totality, that is when the mental capacity is stretched, and that is when it acts like a blotting paper to be able to soak the wisdom. Yeah. There is a science to this, and it's not that he has written these sentences deliberately long. It is absolutely precise. Yeah. It is bang on target. It's just that we have to get rid of our barriers and our impatience and our that is a tough challenge, because we are used to instant gratification with everything, right? And that can come in the way.
Yeah, that's a good point nowadays of pop spirituality, and everybody wants to be healed yesterday. Yeah. But to what you said, I remember, like, also when I started reading it 4 or 5 years ago, certain things that was hard to grasp, but then over time was permeating, and then I'll reread now certain passages from Sri Aurobindo I used to read years ago, and like, okay, boom, something changed. Now I don't not just intellectually get, but there's some sort of more embodied recognition of just a deeper understanding, and it goes within levels. There's a deeper resonance with that. It's hard for me to put into words.
Well, we can say it in this way. Normally when we talk of spirituality, we think of one great realization, right? Mm-hmm. Some massive experience, and that's it. And many teachers and gurus have misguided people in this direction. That I have had one. I know of many gurus in today's day and age, I won't take names, who say, I had this experience and therefore I am realized. That is, to say it in a parliamentary and polite way, that is wrong. So once we start reading Sri Aurobindo, we realize that there are about a few thousand realizations or micro realizations. Mm-hmm. And because the nature of this comes from the metaphysics and the understanding of the self and the complexity of the structures and parts of the self. And at some point we can share some links and books and all that, if on your podcast and all that later. Once we begin to understand that, we realize that in this complexity, at the level of the capacity that we have today, one micro realization of the day itself is tremendous progress. And so it's some aspect of the being, some weakness, some vulnerability, some opening to a hostile force or a temptation or a propensity, right? And because of this very complex structure of the mind and the vital and the physical substratum and their interlinkages between each other, there are various permutations and combinations of vulnerabilities or weakness or challenges, and therefore a corresponding number of opportunities to heal them and approach wholeness, right? So as we begin to read and understand, we realize that every micro-realization does a job on which subsequent realizations or understandings or aha moments or insights, whatever way you want to call them, we can build on. And that is the ascension journey in itself. It's not some one stroke of one day feeling good, which can be had with a narcotic experience also, right? Or ayahuasca, but that ain't going to do the job, because that is some vital expansion or some wideness, which is fine. It's an elevating experience, but that is not spirituality. That is not the spiritual process. We have to make this distinction very, very clear to dispel this confusion in our heads.
Yeah. That reminds me also in a previous episode, Laura and I had about spiritual realizations versus spiritual actualizations. And people get hooked on just some big realization, that comes and goes, like getting hooked on peak experiences, which you can have with certain asana yogic practices, breathwork practices, whatever. You can get that experience, like get the pineal gland open up and get a DMT rush, and all of a sudden you think you're enlightened, but that's not an embodied actualization. And like you mentioned, it happens more, but even more in more subtle ways at this opening, right? In a sense, it's like a widening on all levels.
You mentioned, it's an interesting word, embodied actualization. I like that term. I don't know how you guys have used it, in what context, but I would say that one can say that something has happened not based on an aha moment, but an actual change of nature.
Yeah,
it's that's where the rubber hits the road. Change of nature. Have I changed at the level of being? And this itself is also not a 0-1 switch. It takes time because ultimately even not just the mental and the vital physical body, even the subconscious, which is basically between the living being and the inconscient, as he calls it. There are lots of things hidden there. And through dreams and through yoga, even in sleep, and there are various ways of doing these things, each part of the being has to become awake and has to purify and has to open to the light. Whether one part of the being does and the other part resists, then the change of nature ain't complete. If that is what you mean by actualization, then that is bang on target.
Exactly. So that's what I meant, a change of nature, like an embodied, actualized change of nature, and not just an experience, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Very, very true.
So, excellent, Neelesh. So we're at the end of the first hour. So we covered the 6. What do you call it? The philosophical foundation or understanding, right? And then based on that, we can then explore what the work is to be done on the self, the integral yoga itself, maybe, and Sri Aurobindo's work on that. And I also would definitely love to get into the second hour about what a lot of my readers are aware of, which I've referenced a lot, the occult hostile forces and the adverse forces. There's even a difference from, and remember from our conversations. That will be interesting to lay that out. And also talk about the divine, because I've been reading recently the chapter, The Divine and the Undivine from the Life Divine, which is very fascinating. It talks about how the divine works like, thank you, by the way, to giving me that hint the other day. So it's been very illuminating and very revealing. So I'd like to talk about that a bit, how, it's a paradox, right? The divine, because since everything is one, is a divine, but there's the undivine and the hostile forces, what's going on. So and how this actually plays out maybe in this day and age right now at the world stage manifested a little bit. So thank you, Neelesh. And again, for members of the veilofreality.com, you guys have access to the second hour. If not, go to my website and you can sign up there again at veilofreality.com. And we'll take a little break, Neelesh, and we'll be right back.
All right. See you soon.
See you soon.